Mark's been around for a while. Now, I've been actually after Mark for a while to see if he would do this talk for us. And usually he's away in the Southwest at this time of year. So he's not been easy to get a hold of. But with COVID, he hasn't been able to get around too much. Anyway, Mark's a field biologist. He completed his undergrad at the University of Guelph in 2016, majoring in wildlife biology and conservation. And for the last 9 years, he's been conducting avian fieldwork across North America for different organizations. He worked on the golden wing warbler monitoring in Manitoba. He did shorebird surveys in the James Bay coast, and he spent 5 seasons in the American Southwest, focusing on not only the breeding birds, but also mammals, plants, the Mexican spotted owls, and even herps. So now, since he's been confined to Southern Ontario, he's studying geographical information systems in a postgraduate program at Fleming College. So that is a brief intro to Mark. So thank you very much, Mark. The floor is yours.
Sure, thanks, James.
Oh, wait a second. The floor is yours in 1 minute.
Thanks.
I almost forgot. There you go.
Let's see here, 1 second.
And just a reminder to people to, if they could mute their microphones and turn off their videos. Thank you.
All right, do we have, can folks hear me and see my PowerPoint here?
I can hear you and see your PowerPoint, Mark.
Excellent. Okay, so yeah, as James mentioned, my name is Mark, and this evening I'm going to talk about life in the desert, and particularly life in the deserts of North America and the American Southwest. As you can see here, this photo of the Mojave Desert scrub, it's a pretty desolate and unforgiving looking landscape, but there are a lot of really cool critters down there, plants and animals that are adapted to thrive in just these conditions. So I'm gonna take you on a little bit of a tour here. So here we have a map of North America's 4 deserts. So you can see to the north, we have the Great Basin Desert, which makes up a chunk of Nevada and a bit of adjacent states. Next to the south, you have the Mojave Desert in sort of southern Nevada, southern California. Then perhaps the most famous of the deserts is the Sonoran Desert. This is your sort of Arizona desert, southern California, and then down into the Baja Peninsula of Mexico and into the state of Sonora. And then finally to the east, we have the Chihuahuan Desert, which is sort of southern New Mexico, West Texas, and down through central Mexico there. Now, I have not been lucky enough to spend time in the Chihuahuan Desert, so I'm not really going to touch on that one tonight. But I have spent extensive time throughout Nevada and Arizona in those first 3 Great Basin, Mojave, and Sonoran deserts. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a tour north to south and talk about the deserts, the habitats, and some of the life you can find there. But first, I figured I'd talk about what makes a desert. It may seem kind of intuitive, but the main thing is lack of water. They are dry places. On average, you get less than about 250 millimeters of precipitation annually. This can vary a lot. Some areas get a lot less, some will get more. But the key is that there's always more lost than gain. Not only do they get little water, but they lose a lot of water to the heat and the sun. By definition, a lot of Arctic areas can be considered deserts because it really doesn't snow much in a lot of the Arctic, but the sun doesn't melt it that much. Whereas in the deserts, it's constantly water stressed. And here's sort of a good quote summing it up. So a desert is a biological community in which most of the indigenous plants and animals are adapted to chronic aridity and periodic extreme droughts. And not only they're adapted to those, these conditions are necessary to maintain the community structure. So if it wasn't dry, like these critters wouldn't be there. So the next question that sort of may come to mind is, why are these places so dry? And there are 2 sort of main causing factors. The first are something called Hadley cells. So if you see this diagram on the left, there's sort of these atmospheric circulation systems. So the sun beats down on the equator most directly all year long. So the equator is warm, and as we know with hot air balloons and whatnot, hot air rises. So the air heats up the air or the sun heats up the air at the equator. That moist air rises. As it rises, that air cools. The water condenses, comes down as rain. That's why we have tropical rainforests around the equator. But then that air mass that has risen, it has lost all its water. It's now dry, but you've got more hot air coming up beneath it. So that now cool, dry air is pushed out to the sides, drifts out to about 30 degrees north and south in latitude, and then hot air rises, cool air sinks, that air sinks down to the surface. And if you see this map on the right, you can see the pattern of the world's deserts. And while there is variation, you can see generally those 2 lines of latitude are where these world deserts exist. So this is one of the main causes. And then there are some sort of local causes that kind of change things. And the second cause may rain showers. So it's the same sort of idea, but in Western North America, you have these prevailing winds coming off of the Pacific Ocean, bringing moist air from the west, and they keep coming until they hit the mountains. They hit those Sierra Nevada mountains, sort of in Eastern California. And then down in Southern California, you've got the coastal ranges and you've got the peninsula ranges going into Baja, Mexico. When the air masses hit those mountains, again, they rise, air cools, water condenses, comes down as rain. And then now that cool, dry air crests the mountains, sinks to the land behind, and just brings this dry air with it. And on the imagery on the right there, you can really see how green those Sierra Nevada mountains are, some of those southern mountains to a bit lesser extent, but everything east of those mountains, it's gray-brown, it's dry. And you really can see Great Basin, Mojave, Sonoran, just that strip of desert. So that's why these places are dry. And like I said, I'm going to sort of take you on a tour north to south. So we're starting here with the Great Basin Desert. They call this a high desert. It's not only the furthest north, it's also the highest in elevation, which means it's the coolest. But it's not necessarily a cold place. Summers are still very hot, very dry. It's usually a good chunk over 30 degrees Celsius. Although the lows at night get down to 10 degrees Celsius. Huge temperature swings in the desert because there's not a lot of atmosphere holding the heat in. But the key here is the winters. So the winters in the Great Basin, they fluctuate highs and lows to about 6 degrees Celsius down to -7. So it routinely freezes, and they actually get most of their precipitation, most of their water in the form of rain in the wintertime. Now this is a typical Great Basin landscape. As you'll see, there aren't trees. In the desert, usually there's not enough water away from rivers to support trees, so you get these shrublands that just spread for miles. And usually it's one dominant species that sort of dominates the area. So this is what's called sagebrush steppe. This big sagebrush, which is dominant over a good chunk of the Great Basin in these intermontane valleys. And then in areas where you have a little bit more salty soil, you get what's called salt desert. So areas with salty soil, slightly higher water table, you get this, which is black greasewood, this rather green shrub, kind of misnamed. Black greasewood is dominant. Also a nice pronghorn here. We'll get to him a little bit later. And then salt desert, if you get it a little bit drier, that greasewood is replaced with sort of saltbush and shad scale. But again, all of these, you can see it's these low shrubs. You're not getting trees, sort of this fairly monoculture type habitat. And bird-wise, these shrublands don't support a huge diversity of birds. There's not a lot of habitat structure, but sparrows are pretty dominant, and you get a handful of core species. So up on the top right here, we've got a brewer's sparrow, and on the bottom right, we have a sagebrush sparrow. And these ones are pretty staple Great Basin species. You don't get them to the south. They're pretty much a Great Basin staple. And then this handsome one on the left, this is a black-throated sparrow. That nice white eyebrow, mustache, black throat, they're beautiful. And it's nice because this is a staple desert sparrow through all 4 of North America's deserts. In the low desert, the shrubland, there's always black-throated sparrows. And this group of species, You get them in the sagebrush and the salt desert, pretty much the same species. You get some other dominant ones like sage thrashers and horned larks, western meadowlarks, lark sparrows, but not a lot else. There are a handful of other uncommon species, though, that you will get. On the left here, we've got a greater sage grouse. This is a female, big old chicken that they're most well known for the males display in the spring. They gather and they puff up their chests and do all sorts of funny dances. And I've not been lucky enough to see that, so I've got a picture of this female, but we only see a few a season. They're not very common. And then on the right side here, we have a burrowing owl sitting up atop a sagebrush. They're neat little owls. They're widespread through the West, but always low densities, pretty uncommon. And they are called burrowing owls. They do live in mammal burrows underground, and you see them out during the day more often than other owls. So they're always a treat to find. So it's not all birds. We do have some mammals out there too. And probably the one you'll see most often through all of these western deserts is this one on the right, this black-tailed jackrabbit. They're a big jackrabbit, or a big bunny, a lot bigger than our cottontails. And as you'll see, they've got those really big ears on them. And that's an adaptation for desert life because it's thin ears, and the blood vessels will actually carry heat from the body through those ears and kind of transmits it back to the environment. So it allows them to cool off. And one you will see less often is the one on the left. Now that is a kit fox. It's a cat-sized fox. I think one of our smallest canids in North America. Widespread throughout all of these deserts as well. Perhaps not as abundant as the rabbits, but the other reason you don't see them often is they come out at night. So very rarely do you see them during the day, but they usually go out at night looking for kangaroo rats and mice and stuff to eat. Then I told you we would come back to the pronghorn, I promised. But here is a nice pronghorn male buck. And they are pretty unique. They are the second fastest land mammal on the planet. Fastest in North America. They can reach top speeds of over 80 kilometers an hour. These guys are wicked fast. But what's interesting with them is that there's nothing near that fast for them to run away from. So it's kind of a question of why did they become this fast? And one of the hypotheses is that they actually co-evolved with American cheetahs back in the Ice Age. Now that the cheetahs are no longer with us, they didn't make it through the end of the Ice Age. And now that leaves the pronghorns just sort of faster than they know what to do with themselves out on the sagebrush. And then on the right here, we've got a couple desert bighorn sheep, different subspecies than the Rocky Mountain ones you get out in Banff and stuff. They're found throughout the West in these desert mountains, never super common. Part of that is due to hunting. They're pretty heavily managed now to sort of protect their numbers. But yeah, they're in these sort of desolate desert mountains. You can get these guys if you're lucky. Now, not a lot of shrublands. Mammals, there are some, but the herps and the lizards in particular, they like it hot, they like it dry, they can stand this stuff. So you get lots of lizards around, and one of the most common animals you'll see. So these are a couple of the smaller ones. On the left here, we have a zebra-tailed lizard with those nice black and white stripes on the bottom of its tail. Kind of neat. When they're running away from you, they lift up that tail and it's bright black and white, black and white, black and white, really obvious. They run away from the predator, but when they stop, they drop that tail to the earth. And the top of their tail is much less patterned than the bottom. So it's sort of a method of confusing predators, sort of like, where'd they go? Because it was really obvious and then it's just gone. And then on the right here, we have a Great Basin or a tiger whiptail. This is a very widespread species, kind of fun to watch. They hardly sit still. They're always on the move looking for little insects to eat. And most of the small lizards, they're eating insects and invertebrates. That's sort of what they're hunting on. They're carnivores. But then when you get to larger lizards, like this one, this is a pair of long-nosed leopard lizards. We've got a male on the right, female on the left with those sort of orange blotches. Pretty nice looking lizard. And bigger lizards will eat insects, but they will also eat other lizards that are sort of lower down in the food chain. So that becomes part of the diet. This one is another beautiful lizard and another lizard eater. This is a Great Basin collared lizard. So on the top and on the left there, we've got a couple differently patterned males, and then we've got a female on the bottom there. And yeah, big head on them, big jaws. They're lizard hunters. And you find them typically in rocky areas. You can get them up in the mountains and low down as well, but there's always rocks around. And then I'll give you a second to see if you can spot this one. And he is hiding right there. Shows you some of the camouflage of these guys. This is a desert horned lizard. So these spiny guys, people call them horned toads sometimes. Little spiny guys, they're widespread throughout the 3 deserts. Specialized in harvester ants. You can often find them around ant colonies. And one thing I really like about them is you can really see the variation of the patterns on the back. And that's not even just between areas, but within the same area, there's huge variation on the patterns. And some of them, like the orange one on the bottom right there, really intricate, beautiful patterns. Now there are cool snakes out here too. Not everything has legs. And this is probably the most common, well, I'd say definitely the most common one you see in the Great Basin and the Mojave. You get them in the Sonoran as well. This is a gopher snake, which is a big constrictor, sort of similar to Ontario's fox snakes. They're going around during the day looking for mammals, and they're quite docile. Actually, I didn't pose that one for a photo. Someone handed him to me, and he climbed up my arm, and he ended up completely curled around the brim of my tilly hat, which was kind of fun. But yeah, they're pretty docile, pretty neat to see. And this one, you'll notice, I guess, first of all, you'll notice very different patterns. Some of them are bright red, some of them are black. They're also very sleek, narrow snakes. These guys, it's the red racer or the coach whip. And these guys are built for speed. And they are because they hunt lizards. And lizards move fast. So you need to, these guys are out during the day, which is when the lizards are out, going around hunting for lizards. Then getting into my favorite group of snakes, the rattlesnakes. Super cool critters, venomous, nice rattle on the tail, which is super considerate. They let you know when you're nearby, so you do not step on them. This is the only species in the Great Basin, the aptly named Great Basin rattlesnake. And as we get further south, the rattlesnake diversity increases, but this is the only one we've got up here. Now, moving on to the next desert to the south, we have the Mojave Desert. So it's further south, it's hotter. Summer highs are sort of sitting around the mid 30 degrees Celsius. They often can break 40 degrees. Lows in the summer around 20 degrees Celsius, so it doesn't cool down as much. But then in the winter, the lows don't typically hit freezing. They're usually hovering above freezing. You don't really get snow. You don't really get frosts. You sometimes, but not that often, like the Great Basin. And most of their rain comes in this sort of mild winter rains, sort of December, January. And you may have heard sometimes in the news these super blooms. So sometimes you get particularly wet winters and they sort of create these huge blooms of annual plants in the springtime. And I'll actually come back to that a little bit later. Now, the characteristic plant of the Mojave Desert is this one here. And this is the Joshua tree. Famous, it's actually a type of yucca, a type of succulent plant. Most yuccas are quite small, but these ones grow up into these large Dr. Seuss-like looking trees, really funky things. Only in the high desert. So in the low desert, it's still shrubland, but up above 3,000 feet, you get these Joshua tree forests. And they provide a bit more structure, habitat structure, because there are trees. And so you get some unique bird species. You get things like cactus wrens, which we'll touch on later. Scott's orioles love the Joshua trees, as well as Ben Dyer's thrashers. In Nevada, they particularly love the Joshua tree forests. Now, if you get out at night exploring these forests, you can find some neat stuff too. So on the left here, we have a desert night snake, very small snake. This is as big as they get. And again, night snake, this guy's nocturnal. And on the right, we have a yucca night lizard, so also nocturnal. And it's pretty unique in two counts. The first being that it's nocturnal. Almost all lizards are pretty strictly diurnal. They're out during the day. These guys are nocturnal. You find them almost only at night. And also, they are almost only found underneath dead yuccas. So dead Joshua trees and other fallen plants. So going around, wandering around the Joshua trees, flipping some dead yuccas is sort of the way to find these guys. Now, when you're going around flipping dead yuccas looking for night lizards, you need to watch out for this species on the right. Now, I imagine a lot of you guys can tell me what this one is. This lady's got that nice red hourglass on her abdomen. This is a black widow spider. So this is a western black widow, widespread throughout the West. And they do have a pretty potent venom, so you need to watch where you stick your hands when you're looking for night lizards. And then on the left, we've got a desert tarantula. So tarantulas, they're found throughout the West, different species as well, more in the South. But this one is found throughout Nevada, this desert species. With a big old spider like this, you wouldn't think it would have a lot to fear. But there is one creature it fears. And it is this one here. This big wasp known as the tarantula hawk wasp. Absolutely stunning, aside from their biology. They're big. They're about maybe the size of your pinky, depending on the size of your pinky. That brilliant metallic sort of blue-green body, those bright orange wings. And most of the time, they eat flowers and nectar, pollen, which is really quite nice. But they also have one of the most painful stings in the world of insects. And they use that sting when it comes time to lay their eggs. They go on the hunt for tarantulas. So they'll find a tarantula, overpower this thing and sting it with that potent stinger. Then they'll drag that tarantula underground, sometimes into its own burrow, sometimes into another hole, and they'll lay eggs on top of it. Now the catch here is that tarantula is paralyzed, but it is not dead. This thing is still living. And when those larvae hatch out of the eggs, they will burrow inside the still living tarantula and eat this thing from the inside out alive. Absolutely barbaric, like some sort of alien creature. Parasitoids, they're absolutely brutal, absolutely fascinating in their biology. But yeah, super cool to see these guys. Now, like I said, not all of the Mojave is covered in Joshua trees. This is what a lot of the Mojave looks like. In fact, a lot of the Sonoran Desert lowlands looks like this. Again, back to these shrublands. This bright green shrub is known as creosote bush, and this is one of the most drought-resistant plants out there. And this is the dominant plant in not only the Mojave, but the Sonoran and the Chihuahuan deserts. You just get creosote dominant for miles and miles and miles. Also these low plants, white burr sage, which is sort of its complement in the Mojave and the Sonoran. But like the Great Basin, not a lot of birds in these shrublands. You get black-throated sparrows again, horned larks again, stuff like bell sparrows, but really not a lot out there. It's pretty hot, pretty dry. But one of the cool critters you can get out there is this one here, which is the LeConte's thrasher, one of these sort of desert thrashers. Very localized, like a lot of areas don't have them, and then you'll get them randomly in spots. Always low numbers, pretty skulky, hard to find. And they like nesting, not in the creosote, but where you've got some cacti or some yuccas to stick a nest in. So you can probably see this one up on the top of this Mojave yucca. You may not have noticed the mate, which is sort of sitting down there. And the reason this pair was so cooperative sitting there, letting me nest in this Mojave yucca with 4 fluffy babies. But yeah, there's not a lot to see birdwise down the lowlands, but LeConte's thrasher is one worth looking for. Again, like the Great Basin, herps are abundant in these lowlands, and that's really where these things exceed. These habitats sort of are interesting wildlife-wise. This guy here is a desert iguana, which is a type of iguana, much different than the fat green ones from further south, and usually found in creosote bush flats. And this is one of the most heat-tolerant lizards out there. Like reptiles in general are quite heat-tolerant, but these guys prefer temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius. They will be out during the heat of the day, when most other lizards have gone underground or hiding under cover. The other interesting thing about these guys is they're herbivores. So they're pretty closely tied to creosote bush, and they'll eat the flowers and the leaves. But whereas most lizards, as I mentioned before, eat insects or other lizards and stuff like that, these guys eat plants. Another classic desert critter in the Mojave and the Sonoran. This is the sidewinder, type of rattlesnake. The smallest rattlesnake in the West. They don't get quite to a foot long. And if you notice the photo on the right, they've got these little horns above their eyes. So they call the horned rattlesnake by some. They particularly like sandy areas. And the reason they're called sidewinders is they've got this really neat method of locomotion where they twist their body and they move it so that only two parts of their body are touching the ground, the hot ground at once, whereas the other coils are sort of lifted up and moving into position to touch down and be the touch point as they sort of sidewind along. So it's an adaptation not to spend too much time touching that hot sand. And they can scoot pretty fast over the sand. Now this is another sand adapted critter. This is a Mojave shovel nose snake. And you may be able to see on the left photo, but its bottom jaw is actually inset behind that top jaw. And what you also can't see is that it can close its nostrils. Because while the sidewinder winds on top of the sand, this guy can actually swim through the loose sand. So some pretty cool adaptations to treat sand like water and not get its face full of it. Now, it's not all about animals. There are some cool plants. People do love cacti. And Great Basin, you get snow there. It's got cold winters. Cacti don't really like that. When you get down to the Mojave, cactus numbers shoot up. So this is the largest species of cacti in the Mojave. You can see these big things dotting the mountainside here. This is the California barrel cactus. And here are a couple other species. Because one thing that some people don't know, not only do cacti look cool, they've got these nice spines, they're succulent, they're neat, but they have some of the most beautiful flowers out there. These big, brilliant blooms that attract insects from all over. And they bloom for a short period in the spring. And like I say, attract all sorts of life. We've got a Johnson's pineapple cactus on the right. We've got a beaver tail prickly pear on the left there. Here we've got another cactus with yellow blooms. This is a different genus, a different type of cacti called a cholla. It's a silver cholla. And this one here is a neat one. It's called the cotton top cactus. And they grow in these mounds with heads about the size of a cantaloupe. And also in the background here, you can see this sort of cliffy habitat. So the deserts, they're not all flat. You do get topography, you get mountains. And in those rocky areas, it provides habitat for another slew of critters. So one rock-loving lizard is this guy here, which is the common chuckwalla. It's one of the larger lizards. It's about, it gets to about a foot long, maybe a little bit smaller, and always found in rocky areas. Because when threats come by, they will go and duck down into a crack so that predators can't get them. They do that pretty routinely. And this is another, back to rattlesnakes. I love these guys. But this is a rock lover, and this is a particularly cool one. Which you may think, why? Like, it's just sort of plain, it's sort of tan colored. Blends in quite well to that sandstone though. And what's neat with this species is that depending on where the populations are and sort of the color of the stone in the general area, different populations will have different colors. So these guys are from Moapa, an area we have a survey site there, and all of the ones there are this nice sandy tan color. But this one is one I found down in Arizona, and is one of the prettiest snakes I've ever seen. This nice brick red with these sort of blue-gray icy eyes. And in other areas, you can get them sort of this navy, blue, gray, and white. There's some granite fields in southern Arizona where they're almost pure white. But local populations adapted to those local rocks for camouflage. It's really cool. And then the other thing in the Mojave is where you start to get water, a little bit more water, again, not super lush. You can get a bit more vegetation structure as well, and you get these big mesquite thickets, which are these These spiny trees, they get up to a few meters, up to maybe 5 or 6 meters in height. Some of the big ones, maybe not 6. Fairly large, dense thickets. And then in areas that are more desert oases with a little bit more water, you get this quail bush as well, which is a type of salt bush like the salt desert, but it likes areas with water. It gets into these dense thickets. And this provides habitat for a whole new cohort of birds. You get things in here like Abert's towhees and Lucy's warblers, Bell's vireos, verdins, and you also get birds I actually have photos of. So I'll move on to some of those next. Here we've got a pair of Gambel's quail on the left and a male on the right. These guys are common throughout the Mojave and the Sonoran Desert. You can see that male crowing. That crowing of a quail is a very common sound. They got that nice chestnut cap and that little top knot popping over their head. And another mesquite specialist is this guy. The photo doesn't quite do it justice, but on the left we have a male Phainopepla, sort of this jet black. They got a funky crest, bright red eye, bright white wing patches when they fly, and then his slightly drab her lady friend on the left there. Now you mostly find these guys around mesquites and other trees that have been parasitized by mistletoe. So mistletoe is a parasitic plant that attaches on to and forms these dense clumps in these desert trees. And these guys like them twofold because A, they'll eat the mistletoe berries, and B, they will build their nests hidden inside those mistletoe clumps. So it provides some pretty good protection. So you find these guys usually in association with mistletoe. Now back to the desert thrashers. This is a particularly neat one. One of my favorites called the chryssal thrasher. And that nice white mustache, that curved dark bill. You get them in these desert thickets, these mesquite thickets. And whereas most of these desert thrashers, bendars, lecontes, chryssal, they're all very sneaky, hard to see. But at least the desert scrub ones, there's not a lot of places to hide. Whereas these guys hide in, they're skulky to begin with, and they hide in dense thickets. So they're particularly hard to get eyes on. You hear they got a jury call. You'll hear them a lot more often than you see them. But this guy was particularly obliging. So I got a whole 2 photos of him. Now, moving down to our last desert of the evening, but perhaps the most famous. This is the again, classic Arizona desert going down into Mexico as well. Farther south, hotter. It's upper 30s during the summer, routinely breaking 40 degrees Celsius. It is a very hot place. Winter lows, again, like hitting maybe 5 degrees Celsius, very rarely freezes, particularly in the lowlands. You're really not getting a lot of freezing weather, which really eases up on the plants and the wildlife. So it allows a lot of other stuff to thrive that can't farther north. And the other key with this desert is that you get 2 rainy periods. You get those same winter rains as the Mojave, those mild mild winter rains. But then come mid-July through September, you get these violent monsoon thunderstorms that come rolling up from the Sea of Cortez in the afternoon and the evening and just rocking the landscape with thunder and deluges of water. And this really adds another aspect to the biology and just breathes extra life into the desert. They get rain twice a year, not just once. So it provides for a lot more species. And this is a characteristic look of Sonoran Desert upland. So they often call it like saguaro palo verde forest, the saguaros being the name for these giant cacti, which you can see a few of them in the background here. Cactus diversity goes through the roof in the Sonoran. Again, without the fear of frost, they do a lot better. And you get a lot more trees in the desert. Whereas unlike the Mojave, those mesquite trees, they need a bit of water, a bit of a higher water table. But this is just generally Sonoran Desert upland. You get these trees, you get palo verdes, you get cat claws, you get some mesquites as well, but you get these large trees mixed in with the shrubs, mixed in with the cacti and the giant cacti. So providing some more habitat structure and some more diversity to support the different wildlife, more diverse wildlife. But like I said, The lowlands are still quite similar to the Mojave. They're creosote bush dominated, not a heck of a lot going on there. There are herps, not a lot of birds. But the interesting thing I said we would circle back to is this effect of the winter rains. So they do get rain in the wintertime, but some years they don't get a lot, and some years they do get a lot. So this was 2018. You can see creosote bush. There's a lot of some dead herbaceous plants, but not a lot going on there. And this is 2019, the next year after a wet winter. And you can see the ground is like a lawn. It's covered with green growth, all these weedy annual species. And this is when you hear in the news from Death Valley, they got rain this winter, and you get these super blooms, and the hillsides are covered with flowers. So this can happen when you get a particularly wet winter. Also of note in this photo, there's this whole forest of these chain fruit cholla, which is a neat, funky looking sort of Dr. Seuss-esque cactus. Oh yes, here is another sort of showing that super blooming. This is actually a native species. This is Mexican poppy. These really lovely plants that were just flourishing after that wet winter. But here's a better photo of those giant cacti, the saguaro cactus. They are sort of the defining plant of the Sonoran Desert, and found throughout the Sonoran uplands. Some of them get down into the lowlands, but it's even a little bit too hot for them there. They leave the lowlands to the creosote. But you get them up in the uplands, and particularly dense up in the mountain foothills. But they don't start out big. And as you imagine, it takes a long time to grow that big in the desert. It may take 10 years to get about an inch in height for one of these cacti. So most of the successful ones you find, if you see on the left here, one of this sheltered under this Palo Verde tree. So they call these sort of nursery trees, and this will shelter it, prevent it from getting eaten or sort of trampled by something, give it a bit of protection. So then over time, it will eventually outgrow this nursery tree and then outcompete it for water, and then it will probably kill its parent tree. Now, once these saguaros get to about 70 years old, they will start growing those first limbs. It takes a long time. And then, so you can only imagine how old this one is. But the saguaro cacti, they can actually live to over 200 years old, and they can get to over 10 meters tall. So these things, they're proper trees, they're massive. It just takes them a while to get there. Now, once they start growing, once they start getting those arms, you can see they grow these nice white blooms. So they less colorful than most of these other cactus blooms, but they actually attract nectar-feeding bats. These bats migrate up from Mexico during the time when these cacti are flowering, and these guys are pollinated by bats, which is really quite cool. Now, the bird life between the Mojave and the Sonoran is really quite similar. Most of the species in the Mojave are found in the Sonoran. Not many species that are unique to the Sonoran. But two of the ones are particularly tied to these giant cacti, which aren't found farther north. And as makes sense, two of them are woodpeckers because they actually live in these cacti. So on the left, we have a Gila woodpecker, which is very similar to our red-bellied. And on the right, we have a gilded flicker, which is very similar to our northern flicker. But they are particularly abundant where you get a lot of cacti, a lot of saguaros, because they nest in them. And just like our woodpeckers, these nests allow other critters, once the woodpeckers move out, other birds will move in later years. The most famous one from down in the Sonoran is the elf owl, which is the world's smallest owl. They're, I don't know, only this high, very tiny. They're about half the bulk of a saw-whet, which is already a small owl. So that really tells you something. You may be thinking, ooh, I want to see a cute owl. I don't actually have a photo of one, which is too bad. I apologize. But here are some photos of some cactus dwellers. So actually, Brenda mentioned she had a kestrel up here recently. Kestrels live in the desert as well, but they nest in cacti, which is super cool. And then we also get things like ash-throated flycatchers, which are related to our great crested flycatchers. They also nest in cavities. And not all of the things nest in cavities. Some just treat the giant cacti like trees. So here we've got a great horned owl sitting on top of some fluffy babies. You'll get red-tailed hawks nesting in these cacti as well. Now back to the cacti and or the other cacti and the diversity. Like I said, huge diversity of cacti in the Sonoran and huge diversity of these beautiful blooms. These are a couple different species of hedgehog cacti. We've got an Engelmann's hedgehog on the left and a Yavapai claret cup on the right. And you can really see the desert doesn't have a lot of color. So when these cacti are blooming, it really just lights up the place. And here's another group we touched on before, but prickly pear cacti. A couple different species here, and this one's got a bright yellow bloom. And then this pretty cacti has the lovely name of teddy bear cholla. Called that because it looks nice and fuzzy and fluffy. I assure you it is not. Another common name for this cacti is jumping cholla. And if you'll notice on the ground below them, they have all of these nodules that have fallen off of their arms, these little spiny bits of cactus arm. And you hardly have to touch one of these things. And those needles will make contact and sink into fur and flesh. And just like burdocks here, that's how they propagate and move themselves around, is by sticking into unfortunate creatures or unfortunate field biologists, as it were. So you can get hillsides that are just blanketed with these teddy bear cholla, which looks really lovely, but sort of acts as a minefield. You need to be quite careful. I do love cholla, but I was going to say some birds don't dislike the cholla as much as I do. And one of them is the cactus wren, which is a big old wren that they're very abundant in the Sonoran Desert. Often see them perched up atop giant cacti. This one's on top of a prickly pear, but they nest almost exclusively in cholla. And if you see this nest, it's this big woven grass nest, really not hard to find. So if a predator wanted to take it out, it could, just except it is in this spiny fortress that not a lot of predators want to kind of assault. So they're often pretty safe that way. There are a lot of other birds that sort of follow suit. So this here is a curve-bill thrasher, and here he's sitting on top of a chain fruit cholla. Actually on this photo, you can see all those chain fruits. That's why it's called a chain fruit cholla, all those fruits hanging down. But on the left here, we've got a curve-bill thrasher nest. And then on the right, we have a very well-defended house finch nest with some nestlings in there. Now, this is one of probably the most famous desert birds, most well known, perhaps for different reasons. This is the greater roadrunner. This is what roadrunners actually look like. They're a large cuckoo that spend most of their time on the ground. They are very fast runners, and they go around hunting lizards and snakes and small birds. They are very, very successful hunters. Also super cool to watch. They have all sorts of neat behaviors. They'll flip up their crests and wave their tails around. I hear they're also very good at evading coyotes, but I haven't seen that in the field yet. Now switching over to the mammals, here's a cool one that makes it up. It's sort of a tropical species that makes it up down into the Sonoran Desert. This is a collared peccary, also called javelinas by the locals. And it looks like a pig, and it acts sort of like a pig. And it's most closely related to pigs, but it's actually in its own family that split off from pigs some millions of years ago. But you see these guys roving around the desert in groups. And the neat thing with them is you can see sort of those hairs on the back, those bristles. And when you startle them, they raise up those bristles when they're excited. Now, here's another mammal. This is a wood rat, also known as a pack rat. And you can see on the right, they make these big, the reason they're called pack rats, they make these big middens where they collect all sorts of bits of cacti and bits of sticks and bits of cow poop and whatever, and they pile it up. They make a fortress to live in. And so you'll see these piles quite commonly throughout, actually all of these deserts. And then once the rats move out, this provides shelter for a lot of other species as well. Now moving back into the herps, here's a cool desert one. This is a desert tortoise. You don't get a lot of turtles in the desert on account of there's not a lot of water. But tortoises are okay with that. So this one's a baby one. It was very small, but they get to about a foot long and sort of plunder around the desert. They're endangered or threatened, at risk anyhow. One of the reasons is because when people find them, A, they look cool, and B, the tortoises can't get away very well. So it's common that people sort of grab them as pets, unfortunately. Now here is a handsome lizard. And this is a greater earless lizard. And he is demonstrating what a lot of lizards do to ward off other males and impress the females, is they do push-ups. So you'll see these guys on a prominent rock showing off their stuff and just doing push-ups. And in this next photo, you can see he's down in push-up mode. He's actually doing sort of a full show. He's got that dewlap extended on his throat, and he's flattened his body, showing off those colors. Really sort of neat display. Now here is another classic Sonoran lizard. This is a regal horned lizard. So again, related to that desert horned lizard that we saw before. But these ones have these sort of triceratops, big old spines on the back of their neck, which makes they're super cool looking, super impressive. Now, like I said, the one thing that makes the Sonoran Desert particularly unique are these monsoon rains, this second rainy season. Because in the desert, winter, not super cold, but cold enough that a lot of reptiles are sort of hiding, they're hibernating. Then in the spring, things warm up. Reptiles come out, they love it. It's like getting warm, not too hot. But then come May, come June, water is drying up, temperatures are cresting 40 degrees Celsius. It's becoming pretty inhospitable for even these guys. So, one sec, excuse me. So then when mid-July comes around, these thunderstorms come rolling up from the south. It just breathes new life into the desert. A lot of these critters that have been hiding out for a couple months, they get a new lease on life and they come out to enjoy the rain. But at this time of year, it's still cresting high 30s, 40 degrees during the day. So a lot of snakes and other wildlife switch to nocturnal mode. So the best way to find them is by road cruising, which is what you call it when you get in a car with some friends, put on some cool tunes, and slowly go driving roads at night looking for critters. Because A, they'll just be crossing the road. It's a good way to cover a lot of ground. But B, as the temperatures drop at night, and as these thunderstorms also drop the temperature, the snakes actually get cold and they come to the pavement to take heat off of the pavement. Now, it's not always this obvious, but this sidewinder has actually spread its ribs all the way out. It's sort of maximizing the surface area to get as much heat out of that pavement. And it's like, buddy, this is like, I think it was like, I don't know, maybe about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. That's what, 30 Celsius? It was high 20s, maybe towards 30 degrees, and it was cold. But he wasn't flat. Like, he wasn't flattened by a car. We moved him off the road so he wouldn't get hit. He sort of turned back into a normal snake shape and then slithered off. And when you're doing the road cruising, rattlesnakes are one of the most common species you see. So here are a couple different species as well. On the right, we've got western diamondback rattlesnake, and on the left here we have a Mojave rattlesnake, found also in the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts. But yeah, rattlesnakes are one of the most common species, and these ones we actually found within about 20 meters of each other. We stopped to check this cattle guard, found this guy hiding in there, and then the Mojave was in the bushes. Now, they're not all rattlesnakes. Here are a couple non-rattlesnakes. We've got a beautiful long-nosed snake there on the left, and then we've got a glossy snake, another constrictor on the right. Here's another group of nocturnal lizards. Like I say, there are not many. Night lizards are one of them, and geckos are another. This is the western banded gecko, found throughout the Mojave and the Sonoran, but they exclusively come out at night. And probably the most specialized Mojave creatures are the spade, I say Mojave, what I meant to say was monsoon. Monsoon creatures are the spadefoot toads. Now you'll notice I haven't had any amphibians in this presentation yet. And that is because amphibians like water and the desert lacks water. So you really don't have a lot of amphibians. But this changes when you get these monsoon rains. So these guys, they're called spadefoots. If you notice on the right, they have on their feet, they've got these little hardened spades, and those help them dig into the ground, sort of work their way into the ground. They spend most of the year underground waiting for rain. And then when those monsoon rains come down, they feel the rain coming down from the surface. They sort of wake up, they break out from the soil, they find some water bodies, some little temporary pools, they party, they breed, they lay their eggs, and then they go and dig back under the ground and spend the rest of the year there waiting for the next rains to come. And I'm going to finish this presentation with this guy here, one of the coolest critters down there. This is the aptly named Gila monster. This is quite a large lizard. They get to about a foot long before the tail, and very brightly colored, as you can see. So they're not only large, but they are also one of 2 venomous species of lizards on the planet. You've got venomous snakes of various kinds, not a lot of venomous lizards. It's only these guys, and they have a cousin down in Mexico, the beaded lizard, which is even larger. But yeah, so they're unique. They've got venom. But what's interesting is they mostly eat defenseless prey. They go around sort of sniffing around with their tongue, sort of looking for like quail nests and rodent nests to sort of eat defenseless baby critters of whatever they can find. So they don't need that venom to incapacitate their prey. It is very much a defensive mechanism, because these lizards, they're large, they're quite fat, they really don't move that fast. So in order to protect themselves, they've got these bright warning colors saying back off, and if something doesn't back off, they will latch on with an incredibly strong bite and chew venom into their prey, into their predators, their would-be predators. Unlike rattlesnakes, which have sort of hypodermic needle type injecting fangs, these guys have grooved teeth on their bottom jaw that sort of venom leaches through, but they need to chew that into the predator. And it's not something that will kill the predator, but it is apparently, it hurts like mad. So it really it really suits that purpose of saying back off. And the other cool thing about finding these guys, not only are they just a unique and incredible and large and neat looking species, but they also spend very little time above ground. So these guys spend probably about 98% of their time, studies have found, underground. They hide in old wood rat nests, they hide in rodent burrows and crevices, and they just come out a handful of times a year to go sniff out an unlucky rat nest or a quail nest, gobble up the inhabitants, store that energy as fat in that fat tail of theirs, and then crawl back underground and sort of live off that energy for the rest of the year. So you get them out in the springtime sometimes, and then you can also get them out in the monsoons. But yeah, really neat species, and it's always fun to find one. And oh, here's a bit of a scale, sort of shows the excitement of finding one, and B, how large they measure compared to Rose's foot there. They are quite a large lizard. Anyhow, with that excitement, that wraps up my presentation. I appreciate you spending the evening with me, and I will open it up to questions. So I'll check the chat here if there are any questions, and if anybody, yeah, feel free to type questions in the chat or unmute your mic and talk to me here. And yeah, I'll see what I can do.
Mark, there was a one snake that you showed us that was in different places and it was quite variable, but you never identified that one. What was it?
Oh, shoot, I slipped the name. It's a southwestern speckled rattlesnake.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, slipped my mind. Yeah, southwestern speckled. Excuse me.
Mark, there's one question that I see
Oh, yeah,
in here about,
up here.
there's some about cactus, one about butterflies.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, they got lost in some of the other ones too.
That's okay.
Butterflies, yes, and I, yeah, especially when you get a little bit of water, you can find them. And I sort of dabble in my butterflies. I've got a ways to go, but yeah, you get a lot of blues and some different checker spots. One of the neat ones, it's called a Great Desert hair streak. This black, fairly large black hair streak. That's kind of unique one. But yeah, yeah, definitely a lot of butterfly diversity and something I wish I had started dabbling in more. Why can the birds stand being in the chain fruit cactus? They are very, it's surprising, but they're just careful, I guess, with they can sort of land on the spines and they build the nest. I don't know how they start, but I guess, I don't know, maybe they also don't have super big fleshy limbs. So on those narrow toes and narrow legs, they can kind of land on the land on the cholla spines there. Let's see what else.
I was really impressed with all the reptiles that you saw when you were on your when you were like in the video that you were showing, all the different pictures of the reptiles you got. Now, was it hard to spot them, or like did it take a lot of searching?
It depends on the species. Like the lizards are usually quite common. They're all over the place. Um, and like Gila Monsters less so, or some of the other ones less too. Like I've only seen one desert iguana and a handful of the regal horned. Part of that is I haven't actually spent that much time in the low desert. Like we go visiting sometimes, but it gets quite hot. But yeah, some of the snakes doing night cruising, you eventually pick them up. But most of these photos I've accumulated over 5 years. So you eventually see stuff, but particularly if you're road cruising, because I haven't spent a lot of time there during the monsoon when it's really active. I've done road cruising during May and June because that's when I was doing surveys there, and it's really hot and you go out driving for like a few hours and you get like a snake or two. Whereas in the monsoon, I've got buddies who have had like 40 rattlesnakes in an evening, just driving the roads because so much more comes out.
That's cool. I like
and the
that
reason,
idea of road cruising. That's a neat idea.
oh, it's a lot of fun.
Mark, what's been the purpose of your study down there?
Some various things. So I've worked on some different projects for Great Basin Bird Observatory is one of them that I've worked on a number of projects. One of them down in Arizona was a contract for Arizona Fish and Game, that we were doing the bird surveys as part of a larger study looking at the effects of invasive donkeys. So wild burros are all over the place there. So we're looking on the effects of that. I've also, we contract out for a lot of sort of government studies and stuff. So we've done some sagebrush surveys up in the Great Basin, sort of looking at how closeness to water sources affects the wildlife and stuff like that. Some of the stuff we do is restoration work. So two of our main Mojave sites, they've been restoring them and sort of these desert oases that they're adding more riparian vegetation to and stuff. So we sort of survey them over time to see how those restoration efforts are doing. But a variety of different projects, but mostly working on the bird surveys and then sort of the accompanying plants to go along with them.
Another
Okay,
question,
got some more questions here.
is the cholla fruit edible?
Yeah. Are the cholla fruits edible? I'm not sure about the cholla fruits. I have eaten prickly pear fruit, which people have raved about. Oh, Mexican spotted owls. Yes. So I did spend one season. I spent 4 seasons with Great Basin, but I did spend one season specifically working in the mountains of southern Arizona for Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And we were doing occupancy surveys for Mexican spotted owls as part of a 10-year project to see how their populations were doing. So didn't actually see that many, saw them occasionally, heard them a lot, but we were doing playback surveys for them, a really cool species. And the salty ground, what causes that? I think what that is these are, I mentioned with some of them, it's areas with the water table a little bit higher. And I think it's with the evaporation. So I think there's salt in the groundwater and minerals in the groundwater, but so much of the water is evaporated off that some of the salt and stuff collects on the surface.
Mark,
Yes, yes.
when would be a good time to go hiking in the Sonoran Desert? What time of year?
I would say the spring, like March and April, like maybe April could be quite good. It still gets cool in the mornings, like even down towards like not quite 0 degrees, but it gets less than 10 degrees at night. But then warms up to the 20s. Yeah, really lovely. And then at that time of year, things are starting to get active as well. So the birds are migrating back and starting to breed. So yeah, in terms of proper hiking, the spring, like March or April would be nice. After that, it starts to get hot during the day and you just kind of want to take shelter during the heat of the day. So that's what I would recommend there.
Tips on keeping rattlers out of your sleeping bag?
I've never had an issue. I don't do a lot of the cowboy. I've got coworkers who usually often sleep under the stars because it doesn't rain and there's no bugs. That's one of the beauties of desert fieldwork. There are no bugs, which is nice. But yeah, I usually sleep in a tent, but I've never had friends that have had issues with rattlers coming up and snuggling up. And generally, in my experience, rattlesnakes in general, they're very considerate on having rattles, and if you get too close and don't notice one, they'll let you know, and you're like, okay, shoot, you're right there. I will go around you, and you can sort of stay safe that way. But
Okay.
but yeah,
Thanks,
I've never had
Mark.
issues with the sleeping bag.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, well, Mark, that was a phenomenal presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and you've definitely made me want to get out there and do some of that, the road chasing that you were talking about. I love reptiles. That's one of my favorite things. So I definitely would enjoy that. And your pictures were phenomenal. You must have a really great camera.
See, that's the thing is I didn't have a camera with zoom up until my last season, which is why there are a lot more herp photos than bird photos because I couldn't reach them, and why a lot of the reptiles were in the hand because I couldn't sneak up to them with a little pocket camera. But no, I appreciate it. Thank you.
James, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just really want to thank you so much, Mark, because not only did you give us show us a lot of really interesting features, but you also gave us a really nice background on these 3 different deserts and what made them unique. And, like I said, I really wanted you to give this presentation a while ago, and you certainly didn't disappoint at all. You really covered a lot of kind of the natural history, the species that are there, and why they are the way they are. So I think on behalf of the whole group, I really like to thank you for putting this thing together, and very good job. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, James. Appreciate it.
Yes, wonderful job, Mark.
Thank you.
Oh, look, there we go. We got some of the little clapping hands. Also, I think some people aren't aware, but Mark has graciously been volunteering his time to help North Durham Nature with their website design. He's been giving the directors some tips on the website and managing it, and also he's been helping us reformat it. So you'll see that coming in the next few months, little changes to the website as Mark as his time allows, because he is in school right now. So we got to make sure that you get those A+ marks and then put some web design on the side. So thanks very much. And thanks to everybody for attending tonight. We do have a number of members that are attending our webinar tonight, but we do have a number of non-members that have registered for our webinar presentation tonight. If you are interested in becoming a member, currently, due to COVID, new members are $10, and you can pay through e-transfer. There is information on our website, www.northdurhamnature.com, if you are interested in joining. So hopefully we can have some new members join. And this has been recorded, so you will be able to view it on our YouTube channel. So if you know anyone who missed it tonight who would like to catch up on it, we will have it available on the YouTube channel. It does take a little bit of time though to get that, to do the video editing and the uploading and downloading onto YouTube, but within a week or two, it should be up there for viewing, or if you want to watch it again. So thanks everyone for coming tonight.